Well, friends, it's my privilege this morning to introduce a special friend of Stillwater Church, and not just a friend of Stillwater Church, but someone who is a part of our Stillwater family. Chad Harris is with us here this morning, and he's going to be sharing the message with us today. You know, God calls all of us to be in mission in one way or another as Christians. That's part of being a follower of Jesus. And sometimes God calls people to a vocational mission or a season of vocational mission, and that's exactly the call that Chad and his wife Kara experienced as they were part of this church and got to experience some mission trips from this church, and that led to God working in their hearts and calling them to serve in Kenya. They've been serving there 3.5 years, and they're just coming to the end of that time there. Chad and Kara have done what every missionary want to do, and that is work their way out of a job. And I think that is so cool because they've empowered other people to serve Jesus and to fulfill those roles. So he's going to tell you a whole lot more about that, but you're in for a treat this morning, and there's even a weapon up here, so that can't be bad either, right? So we want to welcome Chad. Thank you for coming and sharing with us this morning.
Appreciate it. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
If we were worshiping together in Turkana, I would greet you all by saying, "Ejo Kasidang," which basically means, "Do you know the good?" And you would respond with a joke. "We know the good." So let's try that out. "Ejo Kasidang." Hey, Ejo, good job. You're naturals. You would fit right in. As John said, we have a long history here at Stillwater. Church in Turkana isn't quite as high-tech as here. So I'm getting used to the technology. Bear with me. But we have a long history at Stillwater. I remember Karen and I taking our first Bible study right behind that door when that was Dwayne's office. And it's hard to believe how much has changed since then. And a lot of great things, a lot of great memories. And you've had a lasting impact in our life. So we're glad that you've been a part of it and a part of our ministry. My family has been in Kenya the last 3.5 years. This is a little bit outdated photo, but you can see 3 of our 4 kids there. And our 2 boys were born here before we left. Our daughter Hannah was born in Kenya, and the newest addition to our family, Bo, was born in December. And they'll all be here at the end of the service with Kara. And we moved to Turkana, Kenya. Turkana is in the desert region of Kenya. It's the Turkana are a semi-nomadic tribe. They're pastoralists. They're animistic, traditionally. And we moved there as part of a church planting team. And so CMF, the organization that we're with, Christian Missionary Fellowship, believes in an incarnational ministry where we try to overcome any of the barriers to the gospel. And so the Turkana have many barriers, right? They live in a harsh environment. It's very remote. Nobody goes there. They speak a tribal language that nobody else speaks. And they have a culture that doesn't like outside influence. So it's a very enclosed culture. And so we tried to bridge all of those barriers. So missionaries with CMF have been going and living in villages since the late 70s in Turkana. And we did the same. So we moved to Turkana, lived in a small village. We learned the language, we learned the culture, tried to be as Turkana as we could be to present the gospel in word and deed. And so the team that we were with, since the 70s, we have taught the Bible, we have started clinics, we have built schools, we have started to provide water in wells and gardens, and we've started a seminary, taught literacy, done a lot of things. We have a lot of ministries that are going. And all of that is a part of church planting. And so for a long time, the Turkana have run the churches. It is a Turkana church. And us as Westerners are kind of outsiders to the church. If you can see in that picture, that's a church service in Kangagate where we lived. And that's Daniel Longole there preaching. He's one of the local preachers. And so a church service, if we were there, we would probably be very uncomfortable, because it is completely Turkana, right? For a church service, we sit together under a tree in a circle with the men on one side facing east, the women on the other side facing west. We'd be there for about 3 or 4 hours under that tree. The group would kind of move throughout the service to follow the shadow. When the service is completely in the Turkana language, the Bible's read in Turkana, sing Turkana songs, dance in a Turkana style. Everything is Turkana. which is great. That's what we want, right? It's their church. And it's exciting to see them take over the church and run the church. And so what our job became, what our ministry turned into, was trying to empower the local leaders so that they could take over the bigger ministries in Turkana. So that it wasn't a Turkana church that had ministries run by Westerners, but that it was the Turkana church that had ministries that were reaching out to their local community. And so my role was in the Community Health Evangelism program, or called CHE program. And so I was training the existing church leaders, giving them skills so that they could oversee the ministries, and us Western missionaries could step back and no longer be the face of the ministry. So that was our role. And me being a teacher before we left, it fit me very well. I did a lot of teaching. I traveled. This was one of the trainings that we did. Basically, I just traveled from village to village, and I would meet with all the church leaders under a tree and would teach for the day and then go home. And I taught lessons in the program basically in 3 areas. So one, we taught basic health lessons on health, hygiene, nutrition, basic lessons that would help them have healthier homes, healthier communities. Taught spiritual lessons on evangelism, follow-up, and discipleship. They're very used to evangelism. They do that very well, but they didn't have a good model for long-term discipling of current believers. And we also taught a lot of development lessons. And so the development lessons were giving them skills for the long-term success of the church. Skills that aren't really a part of Turkana culture. They're common in our culture. Skills like goal setting, step planning, problem solving. We know from the Bible that we serve a purposeful God, right? That throughout history, He has been working towards one goal and one purpose, to reach the lost, to help the hurting. And so we know that as a church, we need to do the same. And so our training was giving them skills so that the church in Turkana could set goals for their ministry and work towards that and have a system to do it. So that was my basic training. And initially, I did all the traveling and all the teaching. And we did just like this picture shows. We sat in a circle under the tree and talked one another about issues. And it was very close and personal. As the ministry expanded, I realized I couldn't do it all, and I trained 3 Turkana guys to help me. And their names are Albert Catho, Maurice Secador, and Jackson Arus. And initially, they would travel with me, and they'd listen and go through the training, and then they started doing more teaching. And finally, before we came back from Kenya, probably the last 9 months to a year, they did all of the training. So they were the face of the CHE ministry, and they could challenge the local leaders a lot better than I could, right? When I would challenge them in something, they would say, Ebenyo, that's my Turkana name. Ebenyo, you don't quite understand. You're not Turkana. Which in some degree, that's very true. I am not Turkana. I don't know the struggles of animism. I don't know really what it's like to go through their struggles. But the guys, the CHE team, could. And so they could challenge them in a much better way. And so they were doing all the training, and finally when we came back here to the States in July for furlough, I was no longer the team leader in Turkana, ministry leader. Albert became the team leader. I transitioned into being an advisor, and so I advised them on their work, helped them with long-term strategy, and Albert oversees day-to-day ministry. And they're doing a great job. Everything is moving on very well there. They did a training 3 weeks ago. They're doing another training this week. And so they are doing a great job. In many ways, they're much better than I am. And it's exciting to see the growth that's occurred in them and the great impact they're having. And so with our ministry, you can see an objective change in the number of leaders that took the training, right? There are 3 levels of training, CHE. And we had over 70 church leaders take the first level of training. Over 30 have taken the second level. And so it is a well-received program. A lot of leaders want to come and take the training. Subjectively, we can see a big change in that when I first showed up, every church leader meeting I went to, they talked about what they wanted to do. And then they would ask me what I could give them to do it. They wanted to do evangelism. I needed to provide something. They wanted to teach. I needed to give them something. And so they believed, you could tell by their questions, they believed they were dependent on me. or dependent on the outsider. And by the end, when I would go to a church leader meeting, there was a complete shift. They talked about what ministry they wanted to do and then discussed what resources they had to do it. So they believed that God had blessed them, that they had resources. They looked different than our resources, but they had resources. They had things that they could use to better their community. They had a way to be an outreach to their community, something to share. And I was there to partner with them, right? If they fell short and needed something, I was there. It was no longer the Westerner over top of the Turkana Church overseeing everything. We were now side by side partnering. And that is an amazing shift and exciting to see. The last year that we were there, we started another ministry called Turkana Child Sponsorships. And really why that came about was that when I was teaching Che, every village that I traveled to and taught, it started, and the program went well, and leaders wanted the training. And that was every village except the village I lived in. And so I was doing the same trainings in that village. The village was called Kangagate. And all of my daily interactions, right, we lived in the community. All my daily interactions were trying to reinforce those teachings, but nothing would happen. Nobody there was interested. And so what we realized after a while was that our presence spoke much louder than any of the words that I was using, any training that I could do. That my presence being there showed that I would take care of them, that they didn't need to solve their problems. I was there. If a crisis occurred, I would save them. If they needed something, I would be there to provide it. And so a year before we returned, our family moved to town. We left the village, which wasn't a good move for our family, but we knew it was what needed to be done for the work. We went back and started the sponsorship program in the school. There were 70 students in the school. We sponsored all 70 students. And with that sponsorship, the students got uniforms and shoes. The students got vegetables for their lunches. We hired teachers, so every classroom had a teacher, provided free medical care at the clinic nearby. We renovated the school buildings, built desks. We did training with all of the parents. And then we provided Christian counseling in the parents' homes 3 times a year. And so we sponsored all 70 students. We had all of the parents in the community go through the training. And we can see a huge change, a dramatic change in that community. In that the enrollment was 70 the first year. The second year was 130. We just started our third year. I haven't heard the number, but I'm sure it's around 200 now, students going to that school. The students that started, they had a teacher in their classroom briefly throughout the day. Now they have a teacher with them all the time. Their scores greatly improved. They have hope. Their school looks good. They know that their lives are going to be better, that if they work hard, they will do well. And we can see a dramatic change in the school, but in the community as well. All of the parents took the training. And so those lessons that I had been teaching in that community for a year and a half and saw no result, suddenly the team, the ministry team, went back and taught the lessons with the parents. And now they understand, right? I'm no longer there. They realize that they need to work together as a community to try to solve their problems. And so when we lived there, they wanted a church building. I said I would help them if they initiated the work, if they said what they could contribute, and they could never contribute anything. And so they never built a church building. After the child sponsorship program started, they said they wanted a church building, and they asked me for 1 kilogram of nails. I gave them the nails, they built a church building. They wanted houses for their teachers, they built the houses for their teachers. Right? They understand now that they have been blessed, that God has abilities in them, resources in them, that they can better their lives and their communities. And so there's been an amazing change there. So I appreciate all of you that have supported us through the years, and you as a church that have supported us through the years. I hope that my being here and talking to you a little bit, just in this glimpse, can give you an idea of what a great impact you've had. Because the ministry really has changed lives, changed communities. And you've been a great part of that. So, thank you. Kara and I recently decided that when our furlough is over in May, we will not be returning to Kenya, and we'll be volunteering our time to still raise money for the ministry. The ministry is going on there. There's no reason for us to return to Turkana, and so we'll be volunteering our time to advise them and raise money for them, but we will be staying here. There's a scripture I wanted to share this morning, briefly from Romans 12, and it's a passage that was a major part of our training there, and I needed to refer to a lot there. But it's also a passage that has been on my mind a lot since we've been back. That passage is Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. It's one of Paul's letters, and Paul says, Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And we can see the passage starts with Paul urging us to do this, right? We know that this isn't something we're going to naturally want to do. Paul knows that it's going to be a struggle for us to do it. He's urging us to do it. And he also says that it's something that should be our response to what God has already done for us. God has already welcomed us and accepted us in our weakness, and it should be our response to that. And so what does God urge us to do? He's urging us to live as a sacrifice, to give up our desires, to give up what we want for the desires of God. Like John talked about for Lent, we can put aside what we like, what we enjoy, and focus on what God likes and what he enjoys. In some sense, gain God's perspective. Now, it sounds difficult or uncomfortable, and I know, at least from my upbringing here in America, that sacrifice is not something that's real common. Right? I wasn't really used to sacrifice in a literal sense, and not really used to it even in a figurative sense. But for the Maasai and the Turkana, the tribes that we worked with in Kenya, we lived with the Turkana. We also helped out the Maasai down country. But I like that the Maasai in their church services, when they take the offering every Sunday, the word that they use for the offering is sadaka, or sacrifice. And so the Maasai are survivalists, just like the Turkana. They spend their days and their weeks just trying to find enough food for their families. And so when they put food or money into the offering plate, they know what it would go for. They know how it's going to affect their family throughout the week. But still they believe in their church and believe in their role. The Turkana are very familiar with sacrifice. When Paul tells us to be a living sacrifice, sometimes I have a hard time even picturing what that is, right? To be a literal sacrifice. I grew up, I never saw sacrifices, right? There weren't too many in Vandalia where I grew up. But for the Turkana, they're very used to sacrifices. Sacrifices are just a natural part of their animistic religion. They happen all the time, often in secret or in the dark. But growing up in their families, they're very familiar with sacrifices. And so one little glimpse of a sacrifice that I would get living among the Turkana is the goat roast. The goat roast is a just basic ritual of being a man in Turkana. So me, being a man living in Turkana, I was part of goat roasts all the time. And they used to be animistic. They've been some of the beliefs have been changed over so that they're Christian now. And it's still a part of every Turkana community.
We're going to take a time out. And you just swap that one out.
Yeah.
This one will be much better to you. Stick that out.
All right, how's that? Thank you, John. So a goat roast is just a natural part of being a man in Turkana. And it's very ritualistic. Everything in Turkana is ritualistic. And the goat roast is the same way. And so for a goat roast, all the men gather together, go down by the river where there's a lot of brush and things. And the goat would be taken down there and it would be allowed to feed while everything's being prepared. We would make a table out of branches in the sand, and the table has to face to the east. And then we'd make a table for the butchering, a pile of firewood to cook the goat, okay, and everybody would be involved. And then finally the goat would be brought in when everything was prepared. Now, goats come in different ways. Some of them jog in like it's just the best day of their lives and they couldn't imagine anything better. And some goats need to be drug in by a rope, right? They had a good tree they were eating, or there was something they liked where they were and they don't want to be there. But no matter what, no matter how they come in, when everything gets ready and they're stood still and they see the spear, their natural instincts kick in. They don't want to be there anymore. Okay, they know somehow by seeing the spear, it may not work out for them too well. And so part of the ritual, everything has to be done in a very specific way, and part of the ritual is that the goat cannot have anything tied to it. And so the rope's taken off, and it's just held for the rest of the ceremony. And so it always intrigued me that the goat stands there calmly through the whole thing. It gets very agitated when it sees the spear, but then through the rest of the ritual, it's very calm. And so the other part of the ritual is that once the rope's removed and everything's prepared, that the shepherd holds the head of the goat. And so the only thing that the goat sees is its shepherd, the shepherd that it followed to the river every morning for water. And so even in the midst of what for the goat is a bad situation, all it sees is its shepherd. It trusts its shepherd. It knows that its shepherd understands it and has good intentions for it. And so it's an interesting example for us. How many people here, let me see a show of hands, how many people here today believe they are at least as wise as a goat? Can I see a show of hands? All right, I see a lot of hands. We still have a lot of hands down. Maybe we need some encouragement. I am very sure that all of us are as wise as a goat. How about you turn to your neighbor and tell them, you are as wise as a goat. Say it confidently. All right. Very good. I know that all of us here are as wise as a goat. Okay, so when we live sacrificially, when we are worshiping God with our lifestyle, there will be difficulties. That's part of sacrifice. There will be painful situations. There'll be discomforts. But through it all, if we can focus on our shepherd, trust in our shepherd, we can see it through. Paul goes on in the verse to say, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And this is one of the verses that was one of our foundational trainings for Che. And Paul is talking about how we view the world, or our worldview, which is a major part of our culture. And so for Kara and I going and living in Turkana, a major part of our first year was learning worldview, right? How the Turkana view the world. Because how we view the world is separate from reality. An easy example is if here in America, if there are two people far away that see each other, one thing we might do is wave our hand, right? Raise our hand in the air and wave. Here that would be interpreted as like a greeting. You're saying hello. You may not see them, but you're greeting them. But in some other cultures, if two people see each other at a distance, one raises his hand and waves, that's immediately interpreted as a warning that they need to stay away. It's a threat. Okay? Now the reality is exactly the same. It's two people at a distance, one waving the hand. The interpretation is completely different. And so that is worldview, how the reality is interpreted. And so in our culture study, we were trying to figure out how the Turkana interpret the world so that, in a sense, we needed to try to see the world the same way. At least understand how they saw the world so that when we taught, it was interpreted correctly. And one of the slides that we used in this example is three trees. 3 trees. One is very unhealthy. on the left, maybe dead. And one in the middle is somewhat healthy, and one on the right is very healthy and has grown up well. Now, what we see above ground is the tree, okay? But it gives us a glimpse into what is below ground, right? We all know that a tree's health is based on the soil. And so in relation to us, we can get a glimpse of our individual lives and as well as our community. That's what we can see, but that gives us how healthy an individual is or a community, gives us a glimpse of what the beliefs are of the community, or what is inside, what is unseen. And so the tricky part, I mean, this is a simple concept, but the tricky part of it is that when we are raised in our culture, no matter what culture we're raised in, we're taught that everything is true, right? We believe everything that we're taught growing up, and even as adults, what we receive from our culture, we're taught as truth. And so even though we may see in our lives and our communities that there are things that aren't healthy, we may not understand why, because we believe we're living on truth. And so the walk of the Christian is to figure out what of their beliefs are true and which ones are false, what needs to change. This is true of physical health, it's true of emotional health, and it's true of spiritual health. We taught holistically. And so some examples from Turkana, it's always easier to see this in another culture, but some examples in Turkana, these are actual examples, would be if I talked about the belief that malaria is caused by dust in the wind. Turkana would say, yes, definitely. That's what it's caused from. That's what they were taught growing up. That's what they believed. If I would bring up deception as something to strive for and be good at, they would say, yes, definitely. That's their number one cultural trait. If we talked about you can get ahead by cursing others, they would say, yes, obviously. Okay? And so we can see, those are the beliefs inside, or some examples, and we can see in the community the unhealthiness of that. So our clinics, the two top things that we treat, one is malaria, and the other one is wounds from fighting, either with sticks or machetes. And so we get a glimpse from the unhealthy nature of the communities, what the beliefs are inside. Now, when we go in and teach lessons on malaria is caused by mosquito bites, and if they sleep under nets, there will be less cases of malaria. Their family will be healthier. We can see a drastic change once they understand that. There's a change in the rate of malaria. We teach that trust is an important part of relationships. If they want to have good relationships in their community, those relationships need to be based on trust. We teach on Christian unity, that if they're a believer, they should want to bless their neighbors, not curse their neighbors. And that's part of being a believer. And so from those lessons, once those beliefs become a core beliefs of the community, we can see a change in the health of the community. And so that was part of the beginning of our ministry in Turkana, was that concept. Now, the same is true for us here. It's much harder for us to see, but we are the same way. We're raised in American culture. We're taught that everything is true, but in fact, a lot of things aren't true. And our lives and our communities show that lack of health. And we're the self-help capital of the world, right? We recognize that things are not healthy, that some parts of us are not healthy. And so, for us, it's hard to see. If we invited a Turkana church leader here, being an outsider, he would be able to raise issues immediately, right? As an outsider, he would be able to see things very easily. But for us, it's difficult. And so how do we have a renewing of the mind? How do we begin to make these changes to realize what is truth and what is false? How do we begin to make our soil healthier, right? Our belief system healthier, so that our lives and our communities will be healthy? And we can only do that through the spiritual disciplines, right? The Bible is our foundation. If we can read the Bible regularly, if we can be in prayer, if we can have fellowship with other believers, if we can fast, like our kids were talking about this morning, we can come to know what is truth, capital T truth, and what is false. We can come to lose our worldview and gain a new worldview, the worldview that God has. In some sense, we can come closer to seeing the world as God sees it. If we don't have the Bible, then we are lost. Anything seems okay as long as the crowd agrees with it, and that's going to change depending on the crowd. But if we do have the Bible, we have a foundation, some security to go to. We can know that that doesn't change. And so why does Paul point us in this direction? Why does he challenge us to do this? And in the end of verse 2, he says, then you'll be able to approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We can see that Paul's perspective is that God is inviting us to participate in his work. Paul sees it as God's work is already happening all around us. We just don't realize it. We're missing it, right? He's challenging us to have a renewed mind, to suddenly be able to see what is already happening all around us. Often we think of God's will as an event or a task or an occupation. But if we can imagine it more as a river, flowing all around us, everything flowing towards God's purpose. And so this river involves many tasks, many people, all kinds of daily interactions. When we see God's will in this way, no part of our day is insignificant, right? Every interaction, every conversation, every mundane task we have suddenly has purpose. We can be a part of God's will if we only realize it and get in. Paul points out that this river is already flowing around us if we can recognize it. It is flowing in our local community, here where we live and work, and it is flowing all around the world in communities like in Turkana, Kenya. God everywhere is inviting us to jump in. Now, I know from my own experiences when I feel that sense of God saying, jump in, get involved, just do it. I have a tendency to kind of put the brakes on. I raise objections, I raise questions, I say, God, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about my security. It wasn't really part of my plan, right? I had things I wanted to work on. God says, no, jump in. I've asked God before, if I jump in, where's this river going to lead me? God says, you can't possibly imagine where to lead you. Jump in. I ask other questions, will I be happy? What will it mean for my kids? God says, jump in. I look at the obstacles. We can hear the rapids downstream. God says, don't worry about that. Look at me. Look at me. And jump in. God has been inviting us to join him from the beginning, and he is still inviting us to this day, if we are willing. If as an act of worship we are willing daily, may we all jump in together. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your grace and mercy, for welcoming us just the way we are. Allow us to have a renewed mind. Allow us to question the world we live in. Help us to begin to see the world as you see it. Help us to have your perspective. Help us to have your priorities and to allow the priorities of our lives to match yours. And always give us the strength to jump in, to join you in your work around our community and around the world. Amen.